Hello, everyone, and welcome to our town hall meeting today. Our topic is a very timely one. It will be about accessible voting, in-person and absentee accessible voting. And our speaker today is Claire Stanley. Claire is the Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs for the American Council for the Blind. She graduated from law school at the University of California, Irvine in 2015, and has worked in disability advocacy ever since. She is originally from Southern California, but has lived in the Washington, D.C. area for 9 years now. Claire also has a female yellow lab guide dog named Tulane. Claire, we're very happy to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. Like was said, my name's Claire, and I work for the American Council of the Blind. ACB loves to help people know what their rights and resources are, as far as our rights for those of us who are blind or have low vision. So if you have any follow-up questions or specific situations that you just like additional assistance with, please feel free to reach out to us. I'll say the email now and I'll say it again at the end, but you can always reach out to us at advocacy@acb.org. You can talk to us about these voting issues or anything, any rights issues. So I'm going to go through voting rights as they concern both in-person voting access as well as absentee voting, which has become very popular over the last several years, especially during COVID. I'm going to go over some of the laws. So hopefully that's not too much in the weeds to hear about the laws, but then we'll do a little bit more practical application as it applies to just the everyday experience of those of us with disabilities who are voting. I don't know if Tara has any rules, but I have no problem with questions throughout. If she prefers that we hold them to the end, we can do that. So let me know if you have a preference, but I love participation because I think that helps clarify things.
Yeah, we're fine. We're not a very big group. So if people have any questions after each segment, you're welcome to unmute yourselves to ask the question.
Wonderful. So first, I'm going to go through some of the laws. So hopefully this isn't too boring or too technical, but I think it's important to know the laws that govern our rights to access voting for those of us with disabilities or those of us who are blind or have low vision. So I think one of the first laws that we often hear about is called the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965. Surprisingly, I'll use that word. It doesn't include much for those of us with disabilities. It was the response to the civil rights movement. So it did amazing things, especially for racial and ethnic minorities, but it didn't do much for our community, for the disability community. So I won't spend much time on it, but I do always like to bring it up because one thing it does do for our community is it does say that you can have someone help you vote if that's your choice. So if you want to bring a family member or have a friend, you can have that. Now, personally, I think we've come a lot further because now you should be able to vote what we often call privately and independently. You'll hear me use that term a lot. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not provide accommodations, but it did say that you could bring somebody with you. So if that's how you're most comfortable, if you want to bring a family member or a friend or that kind of thing, you do have that right. They can't force you to use one of the poll workers to vote for you. So if you go in and they're like, oh, Joe over there who works for the poll station, he'll vote for you. Absolutely not. If you're comfortable with that and you want that, then you could do it, but absolutely not. It's your right to vote privately and independently. And so they could never say this person's going to, fill out your ballot for you if that's not what you want. So that's why I bring up that law. But we've come a lot farther since then, since 1965. And now we have some actual applicable laws that have to do with the rights of those of us with disabilities. So one you might think of is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that does apply. Title II of the ADA has to do with local and state governments. And voting is always done on a county by county basis, which makes sense, but to me is sometimes super frustrating because literally if you live in Fairfax County and then you go down to the next neighboring county, the voting process can be completely different. Um, so it's frustrating, but it's just the reality of how our country's decided to do voting. So that's why we bring in Title II of the ADA, because it has to do with local and state governments. And so accommodations are made there. So even things like, again, not as applicable for the blind community, but making sure people with disabilities can physically enter the building or things like that. But one of the big laws that I, of course, wanted to bring up is what we call HAVA, or Help All Americans Vote Act. And HAVA was passed, I believe it was in 2002. A big part of it was the outcome after the Gore v. Bush decision in 2000. Yes, that was 2000. Which we won't go into that. That's a political issue. But HAVA was also the kind of a result of that, to really talk about how can we make voting accessible for all people, including people with disabilities. And this is where we really got into things like making sure that the voting machines are accessible. So for everybody in the room who's voted before, which I hope is everybody, when you go to a voting site, they're supposed to have accessible voting machines, which for our community have to have both large print and an auditory output and a tactile keypad for us to enter into our votes. So it has to be large print for those with low vision, auditory for those who need the, have lower vision or are blind, and then some way that's tactile for us to cast our vote that's accessible. And we have to have the right to review what we voted for. So that is the in-person things. There's a requirement that every voting location has at least one accessible voting machine. But if you're a really big location, say you're at a location that's in a gymnasium auditorium style, and there's, people are literally coming in the hundreds and hundreds, there are number requirements that say you have to have even more based on the population size, but every location has to have at least one accessible voting machine. The people who work at those voting stations or those polling stations have to have training, which I say with a smile on my face because all the poll workers go through training, but a lot of times I think they learn the accessible voting machine as an afterthought. So I can't tell you guys how many times I've gone to vote and they go, "Oh, Joe knows how that works. No, Sarah knows how that works." And they kind of point fingers at each other, and they have to dust it off and figure it out. But please hold your ground. If they say, "Oh, we're trying to figure it out," say, "Okay, we'll wait," because it's part of their training to know how that accessible voting machine works. And it's their responsibility to make sure that you have access to it. So don't just kind of throw your hands up in the air and say, "Oh, they don't know how it works. I'll just, have someone fill it out for you." No, that's your right. They have to know how to work it. They have to make it work, and they will get it done. So, hold your ground. That's your right. There are different voting machines, accessible voting machines. So say you voted in Montgomery County, Maryland, 1 year, and then you go down to Fairfax the next election. It's not necessarily going to be the identical machine. There's several different models out there. The blind community has done some really great advocacy to talk about what are the best models, because unfortunately, not surprisingly, sometimes there's a really good model and then a different county, because again, it's done on a county by county basis, might purchase a different model because that's their right. It says they have to make them accessible. It doesn't say what model they have to buy. Sometimes some are better than others. And that's why, as advocates, speak up if the model isn't the best. But just know that you're not always going to see the same model. It's just based on what the county decides to purchase. Just reading through my notes. So that's kind of the gist of the in-person voting options. I know a lot of advocates in the blind community even prefer to vote in person because there's a longer history. So I'm going to talk just in a second about absentee voting or mail voting, because that's what we've really seen a move toward, especially because of COVID and just the ease at which it happens. If you're older, if you stay home for whatever reason. But I do know a lot of people prefer to vote in person just because there's a longer history of accessibility. Again, the ADA was passed in 1990, HAVA was passed in the early 2000s. So there's just a stronger history of accessibility. So I know some people prefer to vote because there's a greater likelihood that it's going to be accessible. Don't let that be a deterrent. If you want to vote via absentee ballot, know that that's your right. And we're working toward making it more accessible, but that's kind of the history that we've seen thus far. Again, if you go in person and vote, if you're having trouble with the machine, the poll worker cannot say, oh, never mind, let me just fill in the ballot for you. Absolutely not. It's your right to do it, again, privately and independently. And so you need to stand your ground and say, you need to get the machine working. You need to show me how to use it, but they can never insist that they'll fill it out for you. One more thing about in-person voting, depending on the machine that your county uses, oftentimes the machine will print out a ballot or print out the paper copy. They'll put it in a folder to keep it private or confidential. Then you have to go and feed it into a new machine, and that's how your vote is recorded. Unfortunately, some of these machines that do that, because it prints out a ballot, your vote looks different than other votes, just based on the size of the paper, the font that's used, things like that. And so I'm only bringing this up because advocates are working on trying to change this, because even though your name's not stamped on that ballot, just by virtue of the fact that your ballot looks different, it's kind of screaming, this person has a disability. So it's not identifying you by name per se, but if you're the only one who votes that way, it looks different. It's going to identify you're a person with a disability. Some people don't care, and that's fine if you don't care. But a lot of us are advocating to change this just because we want it truly to be confidential. And so if there's any identifying marker, that is showing that that's semi-identifying who we are. So again, it's probably not the biggest deal at the end of the day. You can still vote privately and independently. But I do like to bring that up because it is a form of advocacy we're working on, just to make our votes truly anonymous, just like every other voter that is around us. So that is kind of the gist of in-person voting. I went through the laws and just kind of the way it generally works. Are there any questions or comments about that?
This is Sandy Newzell. I have a question or comment.
Yeah.
So early voting in person, they're supposed to have a machine as well and somebody who knows how to use it. I think that was a really dumb question, but I just want to clarify that even early voting in person would have that accommodation.
Yeah, no, that's not a dumb question at all. That's a really important clarification. Yes, everything that I just talked about is required in early voting as well. There's absolutely no difference. So if the poll stations are open to the public, 1 week early, 2 weeks, these days, I feel like they're doing it super early. Everything I just talked about has the exact same requirements, whether it's November 5th, which is this year's voting day, or in advance. It's all the exact same requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Claire, this is Davida Lewis.
Mhm.
Question I have is, I thought at one point in the past I might have voted electronically. Is that an option?
Yeah. Do you mean, when you say electronically, are you talking about voting on your computer?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
that is what I would say falls under absentee voting, and that's what I was about to start and cover. So, yep.
Oh, okay, great. I'll
Mhm.
listen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions about in-person voting? Actually, I have a question. This is Tara. So if they say that they couldn't make the machine work or something, what do we do next?
Ooh, that's a great question. They have to find some way to accommodate you. So, they could potentially send you to a different location. I think that would probably be the main in-person suggestion. But again, I would really stand your ground and say, you need to make this machine work. Heaven forbid the machine just doesn't work. Again, probably the next solution would probably be to send you to the next closest location to vote. Yeah,
But that's not going to be an option because we wouldn't be listed in that precinct. They can't send us to a different location.
I think it depends on the county, because some counties you can't, especially with early voting. And some, for instance, in my county, in Montgomery County, we do early voting. We don't have to go to a specific precinct. So that's actually a good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think knowing your county process, because in some places it doesn't matter, but you're absolutely right. In some places it does. But yeah, I'm kind of processing out loud if, heaven forbid the whole machine absolutely shuts down. Oof.
This
Yeah,
is
that's a
Sandy
tough one.
again, and
Mhm.
I have had the experience where I didn't think I was all that early on election
Your voice
day.
is low, Sandy. Can you?
Okay,
Right.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've had the experience where the voting machine hadn't been turned on yet when I got to the polling place on election day. And, they tried to turn it on and blah, 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 and it come up. And, they had to try twice, 2 or 3 times. And I think there was another time that I was voting and they were having trouble with the machine, and literally turning it off and turning it on again helped. So I would say, feel free to suggest to the poll workers, what about if you reboot, just like our computers at home? Sometimes you just have to turn it off and turn it on again.
The other suggestion would be to have them turn it on in the morning so that it's on.
Well, they were supposed to have done that, but they hadn't.
Right.
This is Paul. This is Paul D'Addario, and I wanted to explain something that did happen to me in Arlington County when the machine did fail. This was several years ago, and they don't have this particular system anymore. But it was an audio ballot, and for those of you who are familiar with IT, I got caught in a loop. I was doing the ballot, and it kept doing the same office over and over. And eventually, what the poll worker tried to fix it, tried to restart it, and the message came up that said something like, "Thank you for voting," as if I had finished. So what they did in that case, there happened to be someone with me who was sighted, and so they allowed me to complete a ballot, and I had to cast it as a provisional ballot. And then the next day, I think it was, I went to the election office where they evaluate the circumstances with provisional ballots to see if it, would be accepted, and it was. So things do happen, but I have to say it's been flawless the last, I'd say at least 15 years.
Yeah, I would say, and again, the worst case scenario can always happen, but kind of to echo what a few people have said, I think a lot of times it's just because the people don't know how it works. We're the sole person who comes into our voting location. So I know it's frustrating to have to be patient, but I think a lot of times it's just kind of saying, yeah, like was said, plug it in, unplug it, turn it on, just again, it's not fun to be patient, but just being patient to say, let's try it a few times. I went one time when I was still living in the District of Columbia, and the poll workers were a husband and wife, and I had a big smile on my face because I literally heard them bickering back and forth going, don't you know how to use it? Which button do I push? No, you know how to use it. So I think it's just, again, it's part of their training, but I think because it's more rare, they don't do it as often. So again, there is always the doomsday, but I think 99.9% of the time, they just need to take a deep breath, push a few buttons, so it's just being patient, kind of thing. So
this is Stan Gowan. I want to jump in and say all of these things might be an argument for doing early voting, because often the area where that's done is less crowded than what it might be on election day. But I also wanted to point out that 2 or 3 elections back, I had something happen. Since I can see a little bit, but I basically vote with an audio ballot and because I can't read text very well anymore. Well, what I ran into was I didn't realize that the monitor hadn't been blacked out. That is, And this poll worker was so excited that I came in to use the accessible machine. She was broadcasting to the room that I was successfully posting my choices. And I found that disturbing. So I mentioned that, and I brought that up with the Fairfax County Board of Elections and said, this is what got me started on, boy, they really need more training. At any rate, I wanted to point that out. If you do vote with an audio ballot and you're not going to be using whatever vision you have, you may want to ask the poll worker to blank out the monitor. And hopefully they will know how to do that. It just, because you're sitting there, you're trying to vote, and you don't know how many people can see that monitor while you're voting on it, particularly if, as it's the case, as I've seen a couple of times, it appeared as though the larger print was on the monitor by default. So just a caveat. And
I am
thank you.
so sorry. That's awful. In addition to blacking out the screen, which is a great idea, most of them are also kind of in like booth settings. So they're supposed to be somewhat blocked. So somebody just staring over your shoulder, absolutely inappropriate. So and it sounds like you did it, so I don't have to tell you, but absolutely report that to the polling station. That's awful.
Any other comments or questions about in-person voting or experiences you had?
Kara, this is Davida. Just two quick separate points of accessing today's program. I had trouble. I had pre-registered, so thank goodness you had sent me the link. But I went to the email that came out, the email POB reminder, and clicked on that link. And that, for me, it didn't work. I don't know if anybody else had a problem. So I went back to what you had sent me. So I just thought I'd bring it to your attention in case it wasn't just a snafu on my end.
Thank you, Davida, for letting me know.
For future, could we add one tap options?
Sure, we will do that.
That'd be great.
Thank you, Davida. Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Okay, Claire, floor is yours again.
Cool. So now we can talk about absentee voting. This is when you can get a ballot in the mail and vote privately. Well, you're supposed to be able to vote privately and independently through a paper copy that you would then, generally speaking, put back into the mail, send it in, or you can also often, depending on your county, take that paper ballot back to a voting polling station, drop it in a box, and vote that way. That was really popular during COVID. So absentee voting has become very popular, I think, for a lot of reasons. Again, COVID really accelerated that because we didn't want to go into polling stations and be exposed. But even before that, it's become really popular. I know people on this call are from the DMV area, but just for a broader understanding, I believe it's in the state of Oregon. They all vote via absentee ballot now. No one goes into a polling station. So I haven't heard anything about that happening in our region, but just know, people are really changing. I think there's this idea that maybe more people will vote if you do it that way. My city, specifically Rockville in Montgomery County, maybe 2 years ago in one of our elections, they sent every single registered voter in Rockville an absentee ballot, not upon request, in hopes that more people would vote. I think it was just kind of a test run and see what happens. So just know that it's happening more often. And I think rightfully so, a lot of us want to do it that way. So there's kind of two things we're seeing specifically for the disabled community. And I say disabled because I think although we think mostly for the blind community, it's also for people with other disabilities like dexterity disabilities. Because if you don't have use of your hands, you can't fold the ballot and put it back in an envelope or things like that. So for the disability community at large, there's problems for us to fill out a paper ballot. We can't read it. If we do it on our computer and put it back in an envelope, we might not know. We might not have the ability to put an address on it or sign it in the proper place. So there's kind of two things we've seen. Some states, not all 50 states, but some states like Maryland, where I live, You do have the ability to go online and cast your ballot electronically, but you still have to print it out. So a lot of us see it as kind of, I heard that I was muted. Am I good?
Yes, you're good now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So a lot of us see this ability to vote electronically as like a halfway success because you can go online and vote it privately and independently. But again, you still have to, in a lot of states like Maryland, you have to print it out, put it in that envelope and send it back. And so for those of us that are blind, what if I print it out and my printer is out of ink and I don't know and you can't read my ballot and I just sent in a pointless ballot? Or again, what if somebody has dexterity disability, so even getting it back in that envelope is really hard? So many of us in the disability community are advocating for full access to submit our ballot electronically. And there's a lot of lawsuits and there's a lot of legislation going on to make that a full process. To my knowledge, and please anybody chime in if I don't know about your county or state, to my knowledge, there has been almost no success with the submission of electronic ballots. I want to say, and don't quote me on this, but I want to say something like 30 states have now allowed people to vote electronically. But again, that's just casting your vote. The submission, so there's two parts. There's the voting and then there's the submitting. The submitting part, we have a long way to go. One of our arguments is that people who live abroad, generally speaking, members of the military, have this process called UACAVA. Don't ask me what it stands for, I don't know. But through UACAVA, people who are living abroad, generally speaking, military members, can vote remotely and then can submit it remotely, often through things like email or fax machines. But a lot of people argue, and maybe rightfully so, that that's not safe and secure. And so they're against it. But our argument is, how is that fair that some people can do it, but not all of us? And there's a lot of technology out there trying to develop truly safe and secure electronic return processes. So all that to say, for a good chunk of us, we have the ability to vote electronically, but the submission part is still not completely electronics, again, like here in the state of Maryland. You can, however, if you want to vote absentee, you of course have the right to have somebody else fill out your ballot. I've done that before because I'm fortunate to have friends that I feel trustworthy. So you can definitely do it that way. That's absolutely an option. And then again, you can fill it out electronically and print it out. But then you just need to know the process to submit your ballot via mail. Because for instance, some say you have to sign your signature right next to the envelope or things like that. So just knowing the process. I apologize that I don't know the district of Virginia and Maryland very well to give the precise instructions. But for instance, some states have done some really cool creative things like doing a hole punch in the envelope. And for those of us who are blind, knowing sign your name right next to the hole punch. So they are doing some pretty, I think creative and helpful things to help us be able to successfully cast our ballot independently. But just know it's different in every county and state. And the submission electronically of our ballot, we're working hard both legislatively and through lawsuits. But that one we've got a ways to go, unfortunately. So yeah.
So Davida, what's your experience when you were doing the electronic voting process?
I don't remember. I thought I just literally clicked submit at the time and had no issue. But like I said, it was one time and it was quite a while ago, and my memory is fuzzy.
Okay.
And I told Tara that I apologize for not having the specifics for your two states in the district. So as an after follow-up, I am absolutely willing to look up the 3 states and send those to you guys. But again, knowing that it is on a county by county basis sometimes, so even that can be different. So
this is Paul. Again, I wanted to mention that in the state of Commonwealth of Virginia, Delegate Patrick Hope introduced legislation that some states have, I believe West Virginia being one of them, to allow the electronic return of ballots. Many groups opposed it, including the League of Women Voters in Virginia, so it never got out of committee. Currently, in Virginia, the Uniform over Citizens Overseas, that UOCAVA acronym.
Yep, that's
it's
exactly what I was talking about, Paul. Thank you.
It's basically military and citizens overseas. In Virginia, they cannot submit electronically. They do it the old-fashioned way. I was told by the election office they have to put it in the mail. And the hope, I think, at least in Virginia, is that by coalescing with those who would advocate for the military and overseas ballots to be returned electronically, that we could also gain the same right. I think you're going to see in the news, by the way, as the election gets closer, that people in the International Space Station are going to be able to vote electronically from the station. That's usually a big deal on the news. But yet the groups that have coalesced against the legislation in Virginia anyway have been successful. I'm told West Virginia and North Carolina have passed legislation, and Claire, I don't know if there have been studies about any difficulties with those states who allow it in terms of security, because that's the big red flag that comes up.
That's actually a really good point, Paul. And yeah, West Virginia, North Carolina, I think Massachusetts one that was starting to get moved towards success through legislation and litigation. But yeah, I think as far as pointing out success with those specific states is hard because they're so new. But as far as research goes to prove that safety is not, or security is not a real concern, we, the disability community at large, have really been advocating toward the world of academia to do that kind of research, because our frustration is a lot of the cyber, security people who argue that it's a real problem haven't been able to prove their argument. It'd be one thing if they had all these statistics and data to say, if you do X, Y will happen. In my opinion, and this is my opinion, it's more of a fear mongering thing. If they had all this kind of data to prove it, that's one thing. But we haven't really seen anywhere that they've had proof that it is a true issue. So kind of on the flip side, we've been looking for research to demonstrate the opposite, that we just haven't seen a risk of, a secure vote if you do it electronically. So
this is Davita. I'll ask my daughter Jessica. She's military and currently living with us, so I will ask her how she will be voting. And as we were chatting, it dawned on me that Sandy, Stan, and I may all be in the same polling building. Do you guys both vote at Armstrong?
This is Sandy. I vote at the other one, the other astronaut that starts with an A.
Oh, Aldrin. Okay. Aldrin. Interesting. Oh, okay. So
I'm on the other side of Reston Parkway from you.
Oh, so that makes different polling places. Okay, because I know also within Armstrong there's 2 different rooms for 2 different precincts. So okay, all right. Just curious to share experiences.
This is Stan. Just to jump in real quick, I'm with Sandy because we're on the opposite side of Reston Parkway.
Got it. Okay. All right. Good to know.
I think we have at least 4 people from Fairfax County, myself included, and 3 from Reston.
Yep.
Any other experiences with absentee voting, positive or negative ones?
Okay, this is Sandy. I'll jump in again with the Oregon story, since my daughter and her her whole family lives in Oregon, and her older daughter is going to be able to vote in this election. This is her very first time to vote. And I was saying to her a couple months ago, Gracie, aren't you excited? You get to go to the polls and vote on November 5th. And she looked at me and says, more. We do absentee ballots.
Yep.
Nobody votes in person. But I remember the thrill of the first time I was there on, November 5th, putting my, with other people voting. So they don't experience that communal feeling in Oregon.
Colorado's the same way. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It'd be interesting to survey some of the blind community from those states, because from what I've been told, I've never talked to anybody who's done it, but from what I understand is if you request an accommodation in those states, they will send poll workers to your home to vote, and they send both a Democrat and a Republican so that it's, neutral, quote unquote.
Wow.
There's not a bias, and they'll help you cast your vote at your home, which I think that's great that they're coming up with solutions. I don't know if I fully like the whole process, but I've heard that's one of their solutions.
Sorry, Paul, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I was just pointing out that the same as situation in Oregon is true in Colorado, where everybody is mailed a ballot, and then they drop it off in the mail or in the boxes that are at various locations.
So we usually don't know the results from these states the same time everybody else does? Or do they vote early? I'm just wondering.
They have to have it in. There's requirements of the ballot must be mailed by a certain date, but everybody gets a ballot in the mail, basically, if they're registered to vote. And they don't go to the precinct to vote in person.
One other resource, if you guys have any questions, if you're familiar, every state has something called a Protection and Advocacy Agency, or a PNA, and they're essentially like legal aid, but specifically for disability services. They're funded through the federal government from Congress, and one of the programs they have to work on is voting access. So if you go to vote, go to register to vote, go to early vote, whatever it is, and you have any issues, you can reach out to them and they can help advocate for you. Or, some of the PNAs are actually the ones that even brought the lawsuits, like the one in West Virginia that led to the accessible absentee voting. Virginia's is called Virginia Disability Rights Center, I believe. Maryland's is Disability Rights Maryland, and DC is Disability Rights DC. And I'm happy to provide those links. So if you have any issues, those are also great resources to go to help with these issues.
And if you have any issues, and if you want to submit a complaint, would that be at the county level? What's the process of complaining if something doesn't go right?
I would complain at the county level. Yes. The entities that generally work on sorry, I'm not finding my words. The entity who usually oversees voting on a state-by-state level is the Secretary of State. So if you reach out to the Secretary of State of your Commonwealth or state, that's where you can put complaints. Also, there is a voting rights advocate that literally can help on it on the day of voting, and I am blanking on the name, so I will get that to Tara, but it's a 1-800 number you can call for access problems. They're not going to quote unquote represent you legally, but if you have any problems, like you show up and they say, sorry, our accessible voting machine is down, this is a 1-800 number that you can call and report that, and then they have some of the resources, access, connections to make some calls and say, get it together, what's going on. So it's a voting access entity for the day. Well, I shouldn't even say the day of voting, because now we have early voting as well, but it's a 1-800 number that exists that I can also get for you guys.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments would like to share? Any experiences? Claire, any final notes you would like to tell us?
No, I think we covered it all. Again, I feel like I threw a lot of resources at you, but if you have any questions, again, email acb@advocacy@acb.org. We are happy to answer any questions about voting or other things. Again, know your protection and advocacy agencies. There's a lot of resources, which I know can make your head spin sometimes, but just know that there are resources out there so that if heaven forbid something happens the day of, you can get help that day of, or it's a little more frustrating that you can report after the fact because it's not going to fix it the day of, but at least as follow-up, there's ways to report it so that the next election, we can report complaints and work on it as well.
Well, Claire?
Can I mention one other thing, Tara?
Yes, please
this
go
is
ahead,
Paul
Paul.
again.
Yes, Paul.
I would encourage people to become familiar with their local election office and ask them questions. I'll go back a few years. I called the Arlington County election office and basically said, can I test your equipment? And I explained my situation. They didn't affirm that I could at the moment, but they said they were getting new equipment that they're wanting to test, and when that equipment was available for testing, they wanted some people to test, and so I was able to do that before they purchased the new equipment. So sometimes making a phone call or two to the local election office. And I want to commend something Stan did. I'd forgotten about this a few years back, talking about training. If I'm correct, Stan, you arranged with Fairfax County officials to arranged a meeting, and we showed up, people who were blind and low vision, and talked about the training that is supposed to be done for the poll workers. So sometimes, things like that will pay off, rather than having something surprising happen on the actual day you're trying to vote.
Yes, Paul, I did do that. And it was because fortuitously I knew somebody who was a precinct captain, and he knew who to contact higher up in the Board of Elections. And that was a great thing we did. I think it was 2016. And it was really terrific. And I was glad a lot of people who didn't even necessarily vote in Fairfax County came to that, because it was a two-way street. We basically got training on their machines, which was great for those of us who were going to vote in Fairfax County. But more importantly, we got to give a lot of feedback to people on the elections board, both the people on the board, and there were a lot of quote unquote poll workers there. By a lot, I mean maybe 10 or so. And that was extremely helpful. And I'm afraid it may be time to do this again when we have, an election in the near future, because I think the training has fallen off a little bit, which is why I've been doing early voting rather than going on election day, because it's just simpler, but each to their own. But I want to say, if you're going to talk and find out talk to the local election board, that's something one has to do well before the election season ramps up, because they are understaffed and probably underfunded. And when you get into the time period we're about to enter, a lot of those people are very busy. So I'm not making excuses for them, but honestly, that most of them are volunteers, and you're just one more person in line pulling on their coat, so to speak.
I completely agree with the suggestion of going to early voting if you can. I often do that because, there's the heaven forbid the machine's not working, the poll workers don't know what I'm asking. It just helps me feel more secure that I'm going to be able to vote.
Yeah. I think most of us do that, go for early voting, just in case. Claire, would really like to thank you for coming to our POV Town Hall meeting today and talking to us. It's a timely topic, and I think near and dear to all of us. That's why we joined. And thank you everyone for your comments, your experiences and questions. And
this was terrific. Thank you.
Please vote. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Stan, and everyone else.
Thank you so much. And I will get you guys a list of some resources. Thank you.
That would
Thank you. Thank you, Tara and Claire. Great program.
Yeah, very clear presentation, Claire.
Okay. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Claire and Tara.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.